yet again. Got it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll start this process. I'm going to start again with a land acknowledgement and then move into a review of the terms that we've been discussing so far, and then get into the racial capital scene conversation specifically. So just to remember, I acknowledge that the land upon which I currently reside are the ancestral lands of the Lenape people, whose presence and resilience in Pennsylvania continues to this day. And I take this opportunity to honor them as the original caretakers of this land and recognize the histories of land theft, violence, erasure, and oppression that has resulted in the current iteration of the beautiful Black city that is at the center of my research and which I call home, Philadelphia. In so doing, I identify that settler colonialism and racial capitalism are co-constituent structures of oppression. So as I said, I wanted to make sure that we do a terminology review. I know that many of you have been here with us for the last 2 sessions, or at least one of the 2 sessions, but it's always important to review this terminology because it is dense, and when you're in the weeds, sometimes it's helpful to just remember. So I'm just going to do a quick review about racialism, racism, and race, right? So racialism is that process by which race is created. And this is what Robinson says as at the site of his analysis, which is why he ends up calling this racial capitalism. Racialism is the legitimation and corroboration of social organization as natural by reference to the racial components of its elements. Though hardly unique to European peoples, its appearance and codification during the feudal period into Western conceptions of society was to have important and enduring consequences. So it's really important for us to remember that race is constructed through the erasure of differences, particularly cultural ones like ethnic differences. So the Irish become white, Chinese become Asian, Dominicans become Latino, Latinx, Ibu become Black. So just remember that racialism is that process of categorizing into these larger groupings that render ethnic differences mute. Racism is then the reinforcing of that process, or the policing of that process, to make sure that those divisions are clearly denoted in various structural forms. Of course, the first race that was created, according to Robinson's analysis, was the white race, even prior to the connection to slavery. But whiteness was one of the created phenomenons through this process of economic organization around labor. So he talks about how the term slave comes from actually Slav, which is Eastern European, and various forms of how slavery, modern slavery, was very different from ancient slavery. It became ethnically coded and therefore racially embedded. Remember, early forms of slavery, like pre-modern forms of slavery in the ancient world, that was more cultural and practices around war and military. Sorry, as the thunder starts rolling over our beautiful city. Great conversation for today. We're going to get there. But when modernity turns, right, we move from the ancient to the modern world, slavery gets encoded onto specific labor, global labor organizations, hence the emergence of slavery and capitalism as a co-constituent institutions in a global phenomenon. All right, so racial capitalism is just the reinforcing of those things have always been co-constitutive, that capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it, to use Ruth Wilson Gilmore's phrase, her kind of paraphrasing of Robinson's larger text. And as Robin G. Kelly notes very clearly, capitalism was racial not because of some conspiracy to divide workers or justify slavery or oppression or dispossession, even though yes, that was an effect, but because racialism had already permeated Western feudal society. That move away from feudalism to capitalism was enshrined through racial inequality. All right, and then finally, the term that we're turning to today with the piece by Françoise Vergès on racial capital scene. This concept of Black radicalism is the epistemological form that Robinson reads history through. So this is where he looks back into the archives of oppression and actually finds this other narrative that has existed for a very long time. And that is called what he calls the Black radical tradition. So he writes, the obscuring of the Black radical tradition is seated in the West's suppression of Europe's previous knowledge of the African and its own past. The denial of history to African peoples took time, several hundred years, beginning with the emergence of Western Europeans from the shadow of Muslim domination and paternalism. So there was actually a history of various connections between the West and Africa and Asia, but it becomes obscured and erased through making Europe an exceptional category. Black radicalism, or the Black radical tradition, Robinson says, can be seen throughout history by paying attention to three kind of practices. One being the absence of mass violence on behalf of those who are dominated. So those who were enslaved, they didn't respond with mass violence. Yes, they defended themselves in various uprisings, but it wasn't kind of like gross mass violence. The practice of maroonage, the running away or the fleeing from capitalism's attempt to control bodies through their labor and through their reproduction. So maroonage is that second one. And of course, insurrection, the fact that there were always uprisings. All right. And finally, the Black radical tradition casts doubt on the extent to which capitalism penetrated and reformed social life, and on its ability to create entirely new categories of human experience, stripped bare of the historical consciousness embedded in culture. So what Robinson's saying there is that though capitalism is very much overpowering and is very strong, it also has a lot of chinks in its kind of like armor. So the Black radical tradition as such actually shows us that there's something beyond capitalism and that capitalism is always failing itself. All right. So the last thing I want to go over, which I brought to light last time, was the methodology and the layout of Black Marxism and how Robinson's kind of doing this historical anthropology. So his method of analysis, for those of you who are reading the entire book, because I said to everybody, hey, if you want to read this whole book, feel free. But just to remember, we're not covering the entire book. And this week, I didn't have anybody read any section of the book, but I'm sure others are still working through it. Remember that what Robinson is doing is kind of like taking an anthropological or an archival dig into history. So he starts at the top, which is part one, and that's his assessment of Marxism. And he finds that in that assessment, racialization is part and parcel of the ongoing development of capitalism, something that's very under-theorized by Marx, not completely untheorized, but under-theorized by Marx. And then he digs a little bit deeper, and that's where he excavates world history to show the convergence of racialization and the emergence of capitalism. And that was all of part two, which we discussed in depth on our first day that we had our conversation like 4 weeks ago. And then the third part is like the people that help him in that co-excavation. So the various interlocutors that Robinson is talking to, and that's what he calls the intelligentsia of the Black radical tradition. And there are a great many people that he speaks of or gestures to, but there were three in particular. And last time we were together, we talked specifically about W.E.B. Du Bois. There's also C.L.R. James and Richard Wright that Robinson goes into, but there's plenty more, including people like Claudia Jones, Frantz Fanon, etc. So this week, I'm going to turn to the kind of readings that I gave everybody for this week to take a look at. And if you didn't get to them, that's not a big deal. I'm going to cover some of the basics of racial capital scene and what the concept is and how it's using Robinson's analysis. And then we're going to turn to the city of Philadelphia and like the questions of the relationship between epidemiology and climate change a little bit. We'll get that to the end, but I'm going to give us a lot of time at the end to ask as many questions as you guys have. So feel free to take notes or go back to your notes and we'll get through that process. So let's just start with racial capital scene. So people have probably heard of the phrase Anthropocene. Anthropocene is a term that's been created by a bunch of climate scientists to denote a genealogical turn. It's a genealogical term that describes the human dominance of biological, chemical, and geological processes on Earth. So it's deemed as a geological time or a geological era. The Anthropocene of course, comes after the Holocene. And the concept is that we can see in the actual substrata of the world, right? If we start digging into the minerals or going into the ice shelves in the Arctic, we can actually note that there was a time when the climate really definitely shifted in the world. And that's because of human dominance of that biological, chemical, and geological processes through various things like moving mass amounts of earth, right? Whether that's just like digging stuff up and moving it elsewhere, but also just moving people. But really, people trace, the scientists trace this to the emergence of the incorporation of fossil fuels into the history of capitalism as its kind of like central engine for moving things across the world and for, you know, producing mass goods. So that means that a lot of times the climate scientists will trace this back to what is known as industrialization. Remember, during our first week, we talked about various phases of capitalism, from mercantilism to industrialism to consumer capitalism to what we might have now. And this is a really great, like, small graph that kind of actually shows this impact. This is from Lewis and Maslin, and this is from the BBC, but I'm going to talk a little bit about Lewis and Maslin in a minute. But what I like about this is it kind of like gives you all of these eras, right? From the hunter-gatherer phase to the agricultural phase. And at each stage, you can start to see the acceleration of human impact on the environment. What scholars of this concept called racial Capitalocene, or Francois Vergès, is going to talk about is that the catalyst for what would become fossil fuel extraction actually extends back earlier into the phase of capitalism that precedes industrialism, known as mercantilism, which was, of course, dominated by colonialism, slavery, and the logics of resource extraction. So you actually you don't have the great acceleration of the 1950s or this global environmental impact without the enslavement of these peoples, right? So under mercantile capitalism, you'll see this little ship and you see a man with two people that are in chains. That is a really important like image to pay attention to, even though a lot of people kind of like glance over that, but it's really important here. And that's what Vergès is going to focus on. So this comes from, the Vergès piece comes from an edited volume called The Futures of Black Radicalism, edited by Gay, Teresa Johnson, and Alex Lubin. That came out in 2017, the year after the passing of Cedric Robinson. And in this, Vergès really points to the importance of thinking about racialism or racial capitalism in relationship to climate change and the concept of the Anthropocene, because of the way in which nature has been categorized in the Western canon. She says capitalism relied for growth on the endless access to nature as excess. I think that's a really important point. And from that point of excess, if we see nature as excess, what does that mean? It's limitless, right? There's the assumption that nature will always be there. We can keep extracting from it. From that concept of excess comes the next step in the logic. Well, if it's always there, it's cheap, or we can take it for granted. And that kind of language of cheapness and taking it for granted becomes mapped onto the physical layout of the world, right? The environment, but also on very specific bodies. So Vergès writes, the Western conception of nature as cheap and the global organization of a cheap, racialized, disposable workforce. That happened simultaneously, right? The whole concept of, you know, discovering where we live now, right? That discovery was, look, there's all this cheap land, Europeans can move there and it's free and it's abundant and blah, blah, blah. We know that that's not the case as history rolls on. So again, excess leads to this logic of cheapness, which then leads to the logic of waste. So capitalist production is waste production, what Vergès actually shows. So we can actually see these lines in this kind of like stepping of logic. We start with an assumption of excess as opposed to maybe something a little more nuanced like abundance. We can talk about that a little bit later, the difference between excess and abundance. We can get rid of this kind of falling into the trap of understanding nature as cheap, and then certain people who are naturalized as cheap. And maybe we can stop wasting so much, but that's another step we're going to get to in a second. All right, So I wanted to add this other thing. This is actually coming directly from Robinson's Black Marxism. This is page 186 to 187 for those of you who are looking in the book. But Robinson talks about colonialism in the American case had required a very specific rationale, that rationale of the savage. So the notion of cheapness, but also the savagery, those two concepts go hand in hand in the process of creating the narrative of nature as disposable, and those who are close to nature as somehow deficient or cheap. So this concept of savagery, the colonialists were the advanced civilization. Everybody else was considered savage and therefore had to be domesticated. So that's part of this process of the racial capital scene as well. So I wanted to make sure that I added that layer to it because it's going to become really important. So as I said, cheap and this notion of the savage. So I'm going to take a minute just to remind everybody about the news today. This was actually straight out of the Washington Post that was published this morning about climate and the environment. And the UN came out with a new report about why we are probably past the point of actually doing anything about what's going on, which is in itself a really dark prospect, but I actually want to push back on that for a minute and think about what are the options that have been handed to us, or some of the public policy options that have been handed to us when thinking about how do we reorganize our relationship to products, our relationship to each other, in order to stem the tides of climate change, especially considering that falling back on the trope that technology will save us, right? Everybody was reading that in Vergès as well. Technology will not necessarily save us in this process, even though that's always been kind of the narrative that's put out there. We'll just push it off to the distant future because technology will come up with a solution. All right. So we don't have a solution being pushed. So what are some public policy suggestions? And maybe some of you have heard of this before. So again, I already mentioned Lewis and Maslin with that lovely little chart there. This is actually from their book, The Human Planet. They talk about a bunch of different suggestions, but there's two that I want to pull out. And the first is universal basic income. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of universal basic income. Anybody heard of universal basic income? Yay, probably. We've heard of this one. Good. What Lewis and Maslin say in their short pieces, they define it as a financial payment is made to every citizen unconditionally without any obligation to work at a level above their subsistence need, right? The problem after reading Robinson, or at least part 2 of Robinson, right, is that this definition or this concept, this policy suggestion relies on nationalism or borders, right? It's citizens. Oops, citizens. Right? These are tools that were historically used for the process of racialization and therefore keeping people out. So if universal basic income is deemed as a suggestion, we really need to remember that who constitutes or counts as citizen is important, right? So if we wanted to try to implement this. So I think that's one thing that Vergès gives us when we hear people suggesting, oh, well, let's just implement universal basic income. That'll keep people from feeling like they have to buy things excessively or whatever. The second public policy suggestion is the notion of half-earthing. Has anybody heard of half-earthing before? Yeah, Duncan has. Some other people, good, awesome. People have probably heard the phrase rewilding or restoration. That's usually the terms that are used more frequently than half-earthing. But this idea is that we allocate half the Earth's surface primarily for the benefit of other species. For environmental repair, some of this might include large areas managed through the allowing natural processes to run out, right? Like national parks, or restoration, like reforestation or bringing forests back in. Yeah, blue parks, ocean space specifically as well. Very important. So I want to push back on this because using Vergès, right? Vergès gives this really great analysis of how race is always part and parcel of this question. So my question after reading Vergès is what constitutes other species, right? Remember, again, this language was used in the process of racialization to determine certain people as not quite human, going back to that concept of the savage. Also, when we think about this process of rewilding or half-earthing, how will this map onto the current challenges of inequality inherent in urban planning and development? So I'm going to actually step into a conversation about urban planning and development a little bit, because some of the other readings talk a little bit about urbanization as part and parcel of these big questions about climate disaster, as well as ecological disaster. All right. So one of the big things that's happening in the city of Philadelphia right now is this conversation about the Parkway, the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. On March 20, just this past March, the city reached out to various designers to redesign or rethink the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, specifically because of curbing city heat, specifically. This is an article actually from WHYY, the hot mess of cars to a holistic kind of conception of the Parkway. But the history of the Parkway in Philadelphia is a really rich history of thinking about capitalism in relationship to urban planning. So I'm going to use Robinson's method of analysis and dig down with everybody. So we're starting from the now, right? This conversation has just been had by designers. Here's one in the bottom right corner. You see a map of one of the designer, one of the groups that were coming up with designs. This is actually what they've come up with, ideas in the bottom right. And I have links to all of these things in the PowerPoint, which everybody will have access to after today. So we'll have no problem getting to these links. So we're thinking about the curbing the heat. Let's think about the Parkway. Well, I'm going to go back just 1 year ago, to think about the Parkway and what was happening on the Parkway. And what was happening on the Parkway just 1 year ago was what we now know as Encampment Summer. And of course, this was the fight bringing together Black Lives Matter, the COVID-19 pandemic, the eviction crisis, and the housing crisis in the city of Philadelphia. You started to see the encampments that happened both on Ridge Avenue and in the Parkway. And I liked this quote from the article from Next City. One of the activists at the BFP encampment said, "People will ignore the issue of homelessness if it's not in their face." That was one of the brilliant things about this protest. The organizers and residents, they're folks who are not always listened to, and they were facing off against huge bureaucracies. So I think protest is a beautiful way of leveling the playing field between people who are traditionally ignored and overlooked and people who are in power. So if we think about the Parkway as being a car mess, actually that helped in the politicization of this issue last summer, because people were in their cars. They weren't really walking up and down the Parkway, because this is the height of COVID in the middle of 2020. So people were driving by these encampments, which brought news to the encampments in a particular way. Yeah, there was a similar protest camp in LA, Black Unity, and the LAPD destroyed it. And there was multiple ways in which the Philadelphia PD destroyed and attacked various versions of the encampments. But for whatever reason, the Parkway encampment became really effective. So again, thinking about the environmental side of the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, we have this issue of climate change. There is a city overheating problem, and there's this idea to change the Parkway. But let's also remember the history of protests and Black radical tradition in that Parkway just 1 year ago. All right. So now I'm going to dig even deeper. Oops. Nope, I didn't want to do that. Here we go. And we're going to go back even further to the actual creation of the Parkway itself. So the Parkway, before the Parkway is the Parkway that we know now, there was actually an entire series of neighborhoods that were there. And you'll see the shifting image on your screen was from the original map to the Parkway after it was constructed, what it kind of looks like now. Remember, we talked about Philadelphia as really becoming one of the predominant cities in the United States because it was such a hub of industrialization. So before the parkway was built, this area was understood as an industrial site. It became the area that became Benjamin Franklin Parkway post-Civil War was far from a blank slate. No one is quite sure of the exact sum total, but guesstimates place the number of buildings demolished to clear way for the parkway as somewhere between 1,300 and 2,000 structures. And these included row homes, schools, churches, and industrial buildings that collectively employed thousands of Philadelphians. So when we think about the rewilding, right? So this parkway, the original parkway, definitely brought more greenery and trees. That was the City Beautiful project. If you go into urban planning and design, the City Beautiful movement is very much late 19th century, early 20th century. Definitely brought it more greenery, but it destroyed homes and schools and churches. If we're moving into a kind of conception of the parkway, moving away from the City Beautiful Parkway to what is deemed an urban forest, and I'm using this phrase from Ingrid Safran's article, her opinion piece from the Inquirer, which I've linked to. That's kind of the way in which the new reimagining of the parkway is being described as turning, reclaiming it back from cars and creating an urban forest. So when we think about these different phases or digging back in for a potential rewilding of the space in Philadelphia, we have to think about the consequences of what that could mean over time. And how do we remember what to, and how we can remember what to remember, I guess is one way to put it. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about is the end of Vergèse's piece, where she actually draws our attention to Afrofuturism as a political epistemology that might get us somewhere, as opposed to the limits of imagination by maintaining these kind of narratives of logic, of rewilding or of cheapness, etc. And she writes, this is the quote, "The politics of the possible also rests on the imagination, on the freedom to dream other pasts and imagine other futures than those suggested by the racial capital scene. Afrofuturism, for example, offers a way of looking at possible futures or alternate realities through a Black cultural lens, blending the future, the past, and the present." And I wanted to bring up Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, because I think it became for the, let me put it this way. Octavia Butler was a really important Black author in the history of the United States and one of the most prolific science fiction writers of the 20th century. She passed away before any of her books would actually reach the level of bestsellers or New York Times bestsellers. But actually last year, Parable of the Sower finally hit the bestseller, New York Times bestseller achievement. And it had everything to do with the pandemic. It had everything to do with environmental disaster, and it has everything to do with our political disasters that we've been looking at, whether that's political economy or elections, etc. This is a really important text, and I just want to leave everybody with the quote from Parable of the Sower, which is, "There is no end to what a living world will demand of you." And that's kind of what we're seeing with this process of pushing back against capitalism, pushing back against all of the narratives of climate change as being dependent on capitalism at its center. And again, that notion of a living world is at this really important picture. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen now because that's the end of my lovely little run through. And I promised everybody I'd leave lots of time for questions, any connections you made with the readings, anything you wanted to ask me, but before we take a break, because it's always important to take breaks, right? We'll give everybody a break in a couple of minutes. I just wanted to make sure if anybody had any questions about anything in the slides that you would like me to go back over before we get to our longer discussion.
If you have any questions, you can feel free to chime in. We've got a moderate sized group here, or you can type the word stack into the chat here, and then we'll add you to the list to speak. Duncan on stack.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Yarish. I just want to say that the term racial capitalocene, sorry, I can't say it right, that was a new term for me, and I find it like so important. And like I'm very familiar with the Anthropocene term, but I just think that that term is kind of incorrect, sort of like Anthropocene has the connotation that like it's just people that have dominated this era, this geological era, and that's not really true. Like what's really been the global ecological disaster is, like you showed in your slide, is like the advent of industrial capitalism, and how those impacts are felt so unequally by people around the world, and produced so unequally as well by people around the world. So I just want to say, like, that term, like, I don't know, I like the term Anthropocene. That's like helpful for me, but it's like missing. It's incorrect. It's not. Yeah. So I just I like that racial Capitolopocene term, even if I can't say it correctly.
Yeah, it's fine. And as Walter put in the question, do you think that Haraway and Singh's term plantationocene in comparison to Capitalocene is useful? What I like about plantationocene is it's a specific form of racial Capitalocene. So what I like about racial Capitalocene is it actually covers the variations of the other variations, right? So plantationocene would refer to the plantation as the central organizing principle of how our environment gets restructured. And that's there's something very true about that when we think about settler colonialism as a long history towards the plantation, and then the plantation now in the form of prisons, right? So if we think about that logic, that makes a lot of sense. But Capitalocene without racial also forgets that racial component. So I think that plantationocene actually gets the racial component in there, and Capitalocene will not. But I do think that Vergès' term of racial Capitalocene, which is one kind of a highlight to Robinson's work, right? She's saying this is steeped in Robinson's analysis of racial capitalism, but also going forward to thinking about how racial capitalism has created different iterations beyond the plantation. And I think that that's really, really helpful. And I like her critique of even decolonization scholars who use Anthropocene, right? She talks about Dipesh Chakrabarti. She talks about all of these other scholars who've used Anthropocene who are very much entrenched in a similar conversation as Robinson, whether that's critiquing colonization and the history of colonialism. But she suggests that Anthropocene as a term kind of reduces the human experience down to the same, right? It's all across the same. And as Duncan was just saying, like racial Capitalocene actually points that there are different stratas within the human condition and the human experience across the history of capitalism and how it's reorganized our lives. It also reminds us that there's been resistance to that as well, I think, in a way that I think maybe Capitalocene does not entirely, to kind of get to Walter's point. Hopefully that helps a little bit more. All right. Let's take about 5 minutes, 5 to 8 minutes, and come back at 6:50, so 7 minutes from now. And we'll do any kind of conversation you guys have and any other readings, including getting to the connection of COVID-19. I gave a little bit of a flag when I talked about the camps, right? The encampment on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, because that had everything to do with COVID-19 as well, but there is some connections that we could draw. So let's come back in 7 minutes. while everybody is filtering back, I just want to say there is so much here. I'm sure like I gave up very little things. I rushed through stuff. I wanted to make sure we had time for discussing things. So please, please, please feel free to ask questions, having us go back, go forward, back to other conversations from other weeks, making whatever connections you all had from the readings. Because, I'm here to talk to you guys about your thoughts and how you can think about using this information moving forward, or just in, light of some of the things that are happening. So it's about 6:50. We have 40 more minutes with each other this evening. I want to make sure we have time to answer questions or talk about things. So anything that you have, you can use the chat to type in stuff, unmute and talk if you'd like. But I will leave questions up to everybody. And I'll stop talking now. Go ahead, Duncan.
Yeah, sorry to be the one asking all the questions. I was especially like thinking about last week's reading and the Black labor movement in Philadelphia. Can you recommend contemporary literature on that, or like where can we read about like Black labor in Philadelphia in the last couple decades, like something that's more recent?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the things that I keep coming to for Black labor in Philadelphia has to do with it's the thing, like so many labor movements are on kind of like different fritzes. That's why I really connected back to the Fight for 15. I think that was a really important moment, particularly in Philadelphia, because Philadelphia is very powerful in that movement. So when we think about the sites where industry is the strongest, or where industry is being developed the most, right? The other things that I would say is, because the Fight for 15 was mostly fast food workers, but also care workers, right? So nurses and care laborers. So the fight over Hahnemann Hospital, which was literally 2 years ago, that would be one of those sites that I would say, because the people that were at the forefront of that were women of color, and Black labor was at the heart of that. So those are some of the ones that I would point out the most. And that has everything to do with the fact that the biggest labor sectors in Philadelphia are restaurants, hospitality, bars, hospitals, right? And then the third would be education. So when we think about the fight to get the Philadelphia School Board back in control of Philadelphians, as opposed to the state legislature, because for 12 plus years, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on this one, the control over the direction of the Philadelphia public schools was taken over by the legislative body in Harrisburg. And that actually was also within the last few years as well. So those three labor movements, I think, are at the forefront of those conversations in Philly. Does that make sense, Duncan? Great.
And I guess we've got a question from Walter in the chat there. Vergis quotes Robinson saying, "For the realization of theory, we require new history." Could you unpack that, particularly how it relates to the racial capitalist?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm going to start with that question about history. So Robinson's point about racial capitalism, the kind of the heart of that analysis is that what made capitalism seem natural, right? Like a natural progression out of feudalism, was a big story that was told about the organization of various racial bodies in the world. And that required the erasure of histories, the erasure of the history of the connection between Europe and Africa, Europe and the East, etc. So it became this conversation solely about Europe and then the New World, but then everybody else are just non-actors or actors that have no history. So the uncovering of their histories is central to theorizing our way out of the entrapment of capitalism. is Robinson's point. So when Burgess is quoting Robinson, the realization of theory, right? A theory that we could then put into practice, right? Because from a Marxist analysis, theory without practice is nothing, right? So if we want a realization of a theory that can be employed or deployed for a particular policy position, we require new histories. We require digging into historical paths, right? So my point in our conversation today to use the Benjamin Franklin Parkway as a site for seeing these connections across time, but also in the substrata of the history of Philadelphia in relationship to environment, to ecological crisis, to housing crisis, to social inequality. Putting that history at the forefront of this is really important. So last week I talked about can somebody remind me who it was? Ben Fletcher, right? Ben Fletcher. That there's no marker in South Philly determining the history of Ben Fletcher in Philly, right? We have these great Pennsylvania markers and there's no marker for that. If we're going to see the redesign of the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, there needs to be a marker for frickin' the summer of the encampment as well, because that is part of that history. So the realization of theory, we require a new history. We require to remember the histories of these struggles that are then deemed insignificant to remember. It was a historical moment last summer when these people won, right? 50 plus housing units for a city that has seen a rate of real estate skyrocket into like the thousands of percentages in certain neighborhoods over the past 6 months. These are really important histories to mark. So that realization requires a new history. That's what I think it means. And how it relates to the racial capital scene is that in the everyday business of exchange, right? Labor, exploitation, right, etc. History gets erased, and that's because of fetishization, right? Product fetishization or service fetishization. That's the whole process of the erasure of history. So if we get into that being very deliberate about the story, we can actually start to see how product fetishization breaks down. And then we start to realize, hey, we don't need to buy a new product. We can use the old things. We can reuse things. We can reorient our markets towards something that could be sustainable or futuristic in some kind of way. And I think that could be helpful. All right. So hopefully that works. Any connections that people wanted to make with COVID-19? I know I threw out a couple of readings about epidemiology. One was about tuberculosis, the tuberculosis crisis in Baltimore in the 20th century. One of the things is that, or also, I'm sure people took a look at the Philadelphia Mural Project, the online mural project. I'm sure people have a lot to say about that. They did an amazing job kind of pulling together some of the larger, deeper kind of historical context in some of these other readings and putting those together. So it's kind of why I wanted to put those things together for everybody. Khalil, go ahead.
I didn't have, if anyone has anything specifically COVID related, please feel free to chime in. I guess my question wasn't specifically related to COVID, but was kind of going back to the Parkway example, thinking a lot about the voices, for lack of a better term, that are going to be in the room with any decisions that are going to be made today. The city, of course, whatever design firms or like people they outsource the work to, in addition to the real estate developers within that area. It always seems like you can almost see a similar process playing out today that perhaps played out in other decades or other time periods. And you've got a community that is in many ways like the last person that's heard from, and then and I guess there's times when that community input is weaponized, but when you're talking about what something could look like for the next like 100 years, you almost always kind of notice like when communities have the input and when they don't. So I guess maybe less of a question there, but how do we feel like there is any, how do we break that cycle, I guess, is maybe one place to start.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So I put together this idea about the Parkway at the last minute because I've been reading these various articles that have been, circulating in the city, whether it's the Inquirer, whether it's WHYY, and I kept thinking about that very question, like who's in the conversation. So there's definitely this intention by the city to get input from the city itself, and I put the link in the chat, and it's also linked to the PowerPoints. So when everybody has them, it's always linked there. They've had a conversation with the various firms. There was a panel that was recorded, and people can watch it and give feedback. Anybody, any city resident can watch this and give feedback. And what we can do as scholars of this concept called racial capitalism is bring that conversation to that feedback. I think even at the most minimal level, be like, hey, there's something happening here, right? In the 19th century, right, late 19th century into the 20th century, when the Parkway was being developed, money was given to those people who lost their homes. There was actually, the city paid people off, right? It paid businesses, it relocated churches and schools, et cetera. So there was money that was given to that process. However, right, this conversation of building this kind of urban jungle also needs to be offset with making sure that the historical marker for those 50 plus units that were fought for on that very ground just a year ago gets paid forward in the next 50, 100 years, right? So having those kind of conversations being clear, because as you said, Khalil, this is not just going to be about trees and getting rid of pavement. It's also going to be about who gets to have the real estate on the edges of those trees, right? Everybody knows about the history of the development of Central Park and how 5 Points and the various racial factions were completely mowed over in Manhattan and then displaced into the boroughs when Central Park was made. This could be another one of those times, but we live in such a moment where we're more conscious about these connections and being deliberate about making those connections real for designers, right? For city council members. Those are I think are the important points. And even if it doesn't stick, we're still there saying, hey, this is important. And it's not just important for now. This was only a year ago. This is 9 months ago, right? A baby is, gestated at 9 months. Why can we can't forget a 9-month-old process. And the vision for how we move forward, especially because it's on the same exact land, right? And we can connect that back to, it's easy for us to say, hey, slavery was X generations ago, whatever, civil rights was X generations ago, but we all know that that's not that long ago. 9 months is even a shorter kind of span. So what does it mean to have hindsight in these conversations? And I think that that's being deliberate about those, I think, is effective. For a lot of people who won't even make those connections, because me just making them tonight, some of you would have not necessarily thought of those sites, but now that we think about them, I think it could be helpful. Okay. So yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry, just was acknowledging the comment from LaCherie. My apologies if I mispronounced it incorrectly. But I guess in terms of, and Duncan, you might have some more insight. I know you have a better pulse on like the local city stuff. I guess G&D on like the Green New Deal front, is there any type of committee, commission, or like citizen body?
Is that to me then?
Yeah.
So like at the local government level, council member Gilmore Richardson is leading an environmental, it's not called Green New Deal, but it's I think it's called an environmental subcommittee. And there's like a number of subcommittees around improving land, water, air, transportation, I forget a few others. So I feel like at the municipal level, that's like a main government effort. I don't know, to summarize, like people resistance is harder. there are many groups that are very active. One that not in Philly, the city of Philadelphia, but out in Chester. One that I'm like, I have a lot of admiration for is Circle. It's called, I forget exactly what it's, Chester Residents for Quality Living or something like that. And it's a group of Chester residents who have organized around the incinerator that's in Chester, that is the biggest incinerator in the country and is terribly polluting. And if you're not familiar with Philadelphia, Chester is like a 75% Black and much poorer community within Delaware County, which is a mostly white and very wealthy community, and a pretty terrible example of environmental racism. Like, it's no coincidence that this incinerator is cited in Chester. But like I don't want to talk too much. Like the community resistance against it, the community organizing that Chester is doing, I think is really great. I mean, there's also like Philly Thrive, I think, is another very good community-based resistance. They've done a lot of work to protect air and water quality in South and Southwest Philadelphia that's affected by the PES refinery. That's another one I have some admiration for. Thank you, Dr. Yarish, for dropping that. I guess those are the first two that come to mind, but I think there's like a lot of community and resident resistance to fossil fuel infrastructure, racial capitalism, however you want to call it.
Yeah, and there's also like the Lead in Healthy Homes program in City of Philadelphia, which is also really important, as we see like the lead issue has always been part and parcel of the questions, right? We think of water and lead, but in Philadelphia, it's really soil. The lead is in the soil, and there's some great work that's being done between Westchester University as well as the City of Philadelphia to kind of map where the lead soil is happening, especially as we see movements that are environmentally sound, right, to produce more urban gardening, but then the combination between contaminated soil and urban gardening becomes a question. Reducing lead in school water, but also when it comes to gardening. So I wanted to point out that people are really active in the chat about discussing how many protests have been part of the Parkway's history, right? And this has to do with the ways in which we imagine protests to be streets. So if the idea is to redesign the Parkway to get rid of the streets, hence get rid of the cars, how will we preserve that space for protest? And there, as some people have noticed, they're in the plans, there is a dedication to maintaining that space. But let's think back, not even 10 years ago, with the redevelopment of Dilworth Park. The main reason to do that was to do what? To get rid of the Occupy movement that was entrenched in Dilworth Park. So this is why I think it's important for us to hold on to that history of the protest in those spaces, because it's really easy for the city to pivot away from things like encampments, which becomes an eyesore from a neoliberal perspective of the city organization, farther into the future about redevelopment. Of course, it's really easy for us to get on board with environmental sustainability and kind of reducing the urban heat canopies when it comes to the redevelopment of the Parkway. But what will that do to these other histories? And I'm glad everybody's picking up on that. Okay, yes. Get involved in your local government, get involved in these kind of conversations. And even if it's just, this is a great space for organizing. You guys do amazing organizational work, and it's just bringing these conversations to those sites of city planning and city development, like local politics. And it doesn't have to be a lot of people, right? Just some people, like bringing this conversation from here to there. That next stage is really important. So that's one of the things I would advocate for always. All right, Khalil, go ahead.
And sorry, this is last question from me. I don't want to monopolize all the time, but I guess just thinking back to like the larger topic of like the Black radical tradition, hearing bits and pieces of, you know, both the prior the prior series, how we talked about like Bill Fletcher, and just like that union history, and then also thinking about like the history of the Parkway and like the various groups that or various community groups that are fighting against a lot of what we see. I guess my question is like how can we identify that tradition in real time? Like how do you identify the reporter of that tradition? And then how do we, I guess, go take that lens, and if there was something that was missed, or just due to capitalism doing its steamroller effect, something that we now are only now like discovering, I guess, how do we then pull that to the forefront? And I guess maybe to clarify that, like, who's the voice to listen to, and then how do we then, if that voice just isn't identified because I wasn't there, how do we then make sure that history can be unearthed?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think it goes back to those three kind of practices that Robinson notes, right? So we're picking up on the protests, particularly certain sites of these protests, as being interlocking to the question of race. These are what we would call insurrections, right? The encampment was an insurrection. It was an occupied insurrection, but it's an insurrection nonetheless. It wasn't maroonage in the same like historical way of slaves like leaving, but there's a fugitivity in sleeping in tents in a parkway in the middle of a pandemic. There's something fugitive about that as well, right? That kind of that practice of insurrection. And I think that those moments, whether it's thinking about the Parkway's use when the Ferguson protests popped off, right? For Mike Brown, to George Floyd, to the COVID encampment, to the 90s Million Women's March, like all of these iterations have something to do with this question of insurrection and defending against what would be mass structural violence, right? So those two elements are uniquely entwined, I would say. And because it is hard to see it in real time, it is difficult. But what's interesting is that we're seeing it happen more and more and more because people are starting to make the connections across time and space, right? These connections between the Occupy movement and the COVID-19 summer encampment. We saw those kind of connections being made. And I think if we hold to that long history of fugitivity, and I want to define fugitivity for everybody real quick, because it's not something I've defined for us before, but fugitivity is the resistance for your body to be entrapped by capital in whatever form that might take, whether that's as labor or as real estate. So historically, right, slaves were real estate in the flesh, the idea that they were property. So they ran away or became fugitive to slavery as a way to escape the entrapment of capitalism. Because what does capitalism need in order for it to become capitalism? It needs dead labor. That's what capital, right? Marx defined capital as dead labor. So the attempt to entrap the body through various mechanisms is a way to think about racial capitalism. That's why we talk about policing, we talk about prisons a lot. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Whenever we see these structures of entrapment, right, that attempt to reduce people's capacity down to simply their labor or their bare labor, or to something to just be contained, right? Those are those moments where we can start to see the connections, and those protests are that's when those protests become very powerful and become part of this larger Black radical tradition. Does that make sense, Khalil? Hopefully that makes a little more sense. So Amy's got a great question. Are there ways Philly GND groups can go up against big corporations directly, or would they be more effective in having city government mediate with corporations on their behalf? It's a really good question. I think if I would channel Cedric Robinson in this moment to answer the question, I think he would say both, because there will always be this moment of everybody will have their own interests in these conversations, right? Particularly corporations, particularly big actors. But what happens when people, right, when groups that are working towards liberation have a say or just have that conversation. Having that moment of occupying that point is really important. So it's always that kind of both phenomenon. All right, T, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Yarish. I got to keep my camera off today because I'm a little under the weather, but I just wanted to talk about the use of the term racial capitalism, because I do think it's useful in being specific about what capitalism is, but I also feel like it's a bit detrimental in terms of making it seem like it's this other nastier version of capitalism, whereas like it almost implies, oh, well, there's a better capitalism. Capitalism is just racial capitalism is bad. So I don't know. I just kind of wanted to get your take on that, because I struggle with using that term when, you know, it's important for us to define our terms when we have conversations with people, but I also feel like it might obfuscate the fact that all capitalism is racial capitalism.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I've been in those conversations too, particularly in conversations where you have pro-capitalism from arguments in Black history, right? So like Black capitalists projects, whether that's in the form of a historical phenomenons like Booker T. Washington or even Marcus Garvey, various forms in which, like, well, if the right actors control capitalism, we'll be better off, right? That kind of like argument. If women control the world, we'll be better off, or if, you know, people of color control the world, will be better off. But what Robinson's trying to suggest, right, and you're right, that term racial capitalism, then people are like, well, can we get rid of race in capitalism? Robinson's really clear about saying, no, we can't. Like that's the whole entrapment of capitalism, is that it's always going to be racial. But we are in this kind of conversation in this moment where can we get, let me rephrase this. There's always this need to talk about race and not talk about race at the same time in a lot of our conversations happening, right? Whether we are white, we have white skin privilege, or whether we don't have white skin privilege, there's always this tug of, can we just get to this place where we can fight as a collective, as a multiracial collective against these other projects. And I think that that's a really clear and big issue that's happening. But I want to say we don't have to use necessarily the term racial capitalism to actually get to the point that capitalism will exploit. Capitalism thrives on inequality, and racism enshrines inequality. Right? Go back to that phrase that Ruth Wilson Gilmore uses. I really like that one. That's why I put it in the slide. I think it's really, really helpful, right? Capitalism requires inequality, and racism
is simply the cart, right? The cart that like drives this thing. It's the institution that enshrines it. Could that mean that there might be a time where racism doesn't enshrine capitalism, the inequality of capitalism? No, I don't know, because the whole point is that it's not racism that's the problem, it's the inequality that's the problem. And if we get rid of racism, we just have another form of inequality. And I think that's the thing. Racism is the way in which inequality is most effective in our society, because it makes it most materially clear. Right? That's why it's been so effective for so long. But it's not the only one. Gender has also played that role, right, for a very, very long time. So I guess like I get the impulse and I can see how that conversation happens. But I think if you go back and you're having this conversation with other people, go back to the phrase by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, because I think that'll be effective, right? More effective than like, is there a better form of capitalism? No, capitalism is always about inequality. Capitalism is about the exploitation of people for the purpose of just deriving profit, right? So profit over people, and inequality and racism is that enshrining that inequality. I think that those are always the most helpful parts, for me at least. Hopefully that answers the question. Hard question. Dave, go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I'm on a forklift, but I think what's really helpful for me in that distinction is that like we have trouble thinking of racial capitalism as like outside our current racial order, but I think that's the purpose of like that first section of outlining like how this happened to the Slavs and this happened to the Irish. And this like what's his name, Noel Ignatieff, who was here in Philly, also did the book How the Irish Became White, and like that was really pivotal for me in terms of radicalizing because it explained a lot of things that like my grandparents taught me growing up about how like they lived in what was like a nice Irish neighborhood in Kensington that doesn't exist anymore because they built 95 on top of it. So like it's the same process happening over and over again, even locally. Yeah, the historical aspect of it that he got into in the first section, because I've been continuing to read through that alongside or whatever, is like really, really helpful in understanding like there isn't any other way they could have done this. Like they had to otherize somebody to exploit it.
Absolutely. I think that's great, Dave, because it is very much that it's visceral, right? These are real stories. These happen to real people, and those real people were racialized into being white. Then they end up benefiting historically, but not in the immediate moment. And not always. There are tons and tons of people in the United States, and the largest concentration of poverty in the United States is where I grew up, and it's white. It's Appalachia. The largest concentration of poverty in the entire country, and it's ridiculous. But those people are not really considered white either. But they think they can buy into white privilege. They think that they're going to benefit from it in some way, even though historically that's never been the case. Why? Because they don't know their own history. Right? As Dave was saying, like there are these stories about the 95 and how that ruined communities. We're talking about the Parkway as realigning the 676, which completely destroyed Chinatown. And we can think about the process of racialization right now in relation to COVID-19 and how Asian Americans are seeing some of the hardest hit forms of violence in the pandemic, and both capitalist violence in the form of businesses being hit, but also really direct forms of violence in streets. So I think that process of racialization for the purpose of determining certain bodies and certain businesses, certain cultures as cheap, right? This cheapening of history, or the cheapening of the environment, or the cheapening of communities is part and parcel of how capitalism functions, and it tends to be a racial phenomenon. Meg, go ahead.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for this series. It's been really, really cool. One thing, so actually this piggybacks really well off of what Dave was talking about, was going through and the way that Dr. Robinson sort of deconstructs and reconstructs in a way the history. I was wondering, and also like being that I live in West Philly, I live near Penn, and talk about communities that were destroyed, and thinking about like 676 and all these different examples of where this happened. And I guess I was wondering if you had any recommendations of further reading about sort of breaking down some of that history in like a local Philadelphia context.
Yeah, it's a great question. So our second meeting, I talked a lot about The Philadelphia Negro by Du Bois, which of course was written back in the 19th century, so old. But there's a great book called Black City Makers by Professor Marcus Anthony Hunter, who is born and raised Philadelphian, professor of sociology. He was at UCLA. He might still be at UCLA. I'm not sure. He was at UCLA, but he wrote this great book called Black City Makers, where he actually brings the Philadelphia Negro up to the 21st century. So that's a really great piece. Talks a lot about like the Black radical tradition and thinking about the fight that South Street, or what was the former 7th Ward, had to fight against also another parkway that was supposed to cut across underneath Market, right down at South Street. They were actually supposed to like completely gut that out and destroy the historic Black community there to create another kind of like connecting highway between 95 and 76. So that one's really helpful. Color of Law does a really good job, as already stated, discussing urban planning and segregation and destroying BIPOC neighborhoods as well. That Matt brought up. Color of Law definitely, I think, is mostly Chicago. They do their analysis. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but there is not just Chicago, other cities where this is done. And as Walter said, The History of the World in 7 Cheap Things does a great job of tying together threads of the history of racial capitalism on a global scale. But if you want to think about Philly, specific conversations of Philly, Black City Makers is a really great text. It's about 10 years old at this point, but it's still a really helpful text. It's not like ancient. But yeah, there's another one that I was going to suggest. If people haven't seen it yet, of course, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's book, Race for Profit, which goes into the history of the Federal Housing Authority, right, FHA, but also focuses on Philadelphia. Her work on From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation focuses a lot on the Philadelphia Police Department as well. There's a whole chapter dedicated to the Philadelphia Police Department. So that's all Philly specific. Or something else that I was going to come up with, but I'll think about it. But Black City Makers is definitely a really good one. So I always like putting that one out there. Yes, Richard Rothstein. Yeah, the violence that took place in Levittown. So Levittown is the very first planned suburb that was then replicated across the United States. And of course, the first one was right outside of Philadelphia, Levittown on the border of New Jersey. So yes, thank you for that one, Matt, because that one is the one I couldn't remember. I was like, it wasn't Philly specific, but it's related to the white flight of Philadelphia, which is Philadelphia specific. So yes, thank you. All right, we have about 4 more minutes. I know we've had some amazing conversations. I would love to be able to be there with y'all in person next week, but unfortunately I have to go to DC to start my work. But sometime I will definitely come back and be a part of all of the conversations because I've had so much fun with everyone. And I know that people asked, if you wanted to share the videos with your unions, with, people in your other reading groups, share the slides, share the videos. Absolutely. Please, please, please do that. Feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'll throw my university email in the chat as well, because that one I tend to check more frequently during the school year than my Gmail, even though I do my best to do both. I'm always happy to talk to people about their readings and how it's going, and other reading groups that you have. If you want to invite me into to have conversations, I'm happy to do so. But I've had so much fun with y'all. Hopefully you've learned more about Philly a little bit, but also more about racial capital scene as along in the bigger kind of context of these kind of conversations. But as the one thing that I'll remind everybody is go back to those kind of early stages where I talked about the phases of capitalism, right? And the current phase of capitalism that we're in, whether we know it as surveillance capitalism, communicative capitalism, information capitalism, Robinson never updated Black Marxism to think about this stage, right? So it is on to us to keep reading his work, to go back to that history, as Dave was pointing out, that earlier phase of how capitalism got instituted, and see how it's being replicated again and again and again. And the erasure of the stories of the Black radical tradition, even if it's 2 months away or 9 months away, as I was saying with the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, those are part and parcel of what makes racial capitalism continue to dig deep, regardless of the fact that technology and markets are changing rapidly around us. So it's important to remember those histories and push for those histories to be part and parcel of whatever plans we are making in the place that we call home, which is Philly. And of course, there's more people on here than are Philly. Wherever you call home, those stories are really important. So I want to push that. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and nothing else to add, really. Again, thank you, Dr. Yarish. We really do appreciate it. And in terms of next steps, as soon as I get it uploaded, I'll pass along the recording so everyone can watch again, as well as pass it along to your friends. And in terms of like the links in the chat, I should be able to pass along the chat file as well. But yeah, I think that's about it. If you're able to, please attend the Racial Justice Committee meeting that we'll have next week. That'll be on Wednesday at 6. And then as an aside, for those in the Philly area, I know, the Delta variant's kind of popping up, but Philly DSA is, as of right now, still having a barbecue / cookout event on the 22nd, which is Sunday, I believe it is. So more details to come there, but be on the lookout for more info in one of the next bulletins. But that's about it, and thank you all for coming. Everyone have a good night.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Yarish.